If you don't sign, Mom won't see the morning. If stories of healing and second chances touch your heart, please consider subscribing and staying with us until the very last chapter of this journey. The sliding doors of Mount Sinai Morningside's emergency department burst open against the icy wind of a Manhattan winter night. Mason Whitfield, his long coat snapping behind him, followed a small girl who clutched a blue ribbon in one trembling hand and a notebook in the other. Her name was Ava, 7 years old, fragile in frame but fierce in her pleading eyes. Inside, the waiting room was a blur of fluorescent light and muted panic. Ambulance sirens faded into the night as gurneys rattled through hallways smelling of antiseptic and snow-wet wool. A nurse in navy scrubs spotted Ava running barefoot across the linoleum, her pink socks soaked through with ice. "She can't breathe!" Ava cried, pointing back toward the stretcher that 2 paramedics wheeled in behind her. Rachel, her mother, lay strapped beneath blankets, her lips tinged violet, every inhale a shallow gasp. The heart monitor clipped to her finger screamed irregular beats, tachycardia chasing oxygen that refused to stay. "Pulmonary edema, bring BiPAP!" shouted Dr. Patel, the attending cardiologist on duty, as he rushed alongside the stretcher. His voice carried the practiced urgency of a man who had seen death walk these halls before. A respiratory therapist snapped open a mask, fitting it over Rachel's face as her chest heaved like a drowning woman's. Clear froth bubbled at the corners of her lips. The monitor's pulse oximeter dipped below 80%. Ava clung to Mason's coat sleeve, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Don't let her die. Please, don't let her die." Mason had never been inside an emergency room before. His world was boardrooms of glass and steel, not these hallways filled with desperation. He stood stiff, his jaw clenched, as if sheer force of will might stabilize the numbers flashing red on the monitor. "NYHA Class 4, heart failure," Dr. Patel muttered grimly while listening through his stethoscope. "Severe crackles, bilateral rails. She's drowning in her own lungs." Rachel's body jolted as another wave of arrhythmia pulsed across the screen. Nurses leaned in with practiced choreography. IV line, nitroglycerin drip, crash cart parked at the foot of the bed. The room swelled with noise, the hiss of oxygen, the beeping alarm, the shouted commands. Mason's eyes, trained to decipher quarterly reports and shareholder demands, now locked on the jagged green lines dancing on the monitor. Each dip lower, each erratic leap, struck him like numbers spelling catastrophe in a language he didn't know how to read. Ava pressed closer. "That's why she wakes up at night, right? Because she can't breathe?" Her small voice was directed not at Mason, but into the storm of doctors, cutting the air with a raw clarity that made them pause for half a heartbeat. "She needs surgery," Dr. Patel replied, lowering his mask just enough for his words to carry. "Without it, hours, not weeks, hours." Mason swallowed hard. He had walked into countless hostile negotiations, but never had words felt so final, so merciless. He was not Rachel's husband, not her brother, not even kin. He was only a man who happened to be standing there when the girl looked up at him with eyes that refused to let go. The team wheeled Rachel toward an ER bay, monitors trailing, IV bags swaying. Mason followed without permission, Ava's hand locked in his. Inside the curtained space, Rachel's breaths rattled under the BiPAP mask. A nurse adjusted the oxygen flow while another typed into the EMR system, her keystrokes rapid. Mason tried to speak but found his throat closed. He reached into his pocket for something familiar, his phone, his calendar, his shield of logic, but his hand came up empty. This was not a crisis solvable by spreadsheets. Dr. Patel turned sharply. "We are prepping for emergent valve repair. She has severe mitral regurgitation, ejection fraction down to 30, maybe 35%. The left ventricle is failing. Ava whimpered, clutching her ribbon. What does that mean? It means, the doctor said gently but firmly, her heart is too weak to keep her alive without surgery. The curtain swayed as a nurse entered, holding a clipboard. Consent form for mitral valve repair, she said, laying the papers on the bedside table. Her eyes flicked toward Mason. Are you the guardian? Mason froze. The fluorescent light glared against the paper's black print. Surgical consent. Mitral valve repair with annuloplasty and neocordae. Before he could answer, Ava grabbed the clipboard with both hands. The paper shook as she held it up to him, her little arms straining. You have to sign, sir, she whispered. You're the only one here. The world went silent for Mason. He saw his reflection in the plastic clipboard cover, the tailored coat, the silk tie, the face people called powerful. But power meant nothing in this room. Here, signatures were not symbols of deals struck in boardrooms. They were lifelines. Yet he knew he was not legally allowed. His pen could not open the doors to the operating room. I can't, he murmured, voice cracking in a way it never had before. I'm not your mother's guardian. Ava's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came. Her small body trembled as the reality sank in. The paper she held so desperately was useless in his hands. Mason stood there, unable to move, as Rachel's monitor shrieked with another drop in oxygen saturation. The green lines on the screen jagged downward again. He felt the walls of the ER closing in, the sterile air suffocating. For the first time in his life, Mason Whitfield, the man who never backed away from a contract, faced a signature he could not give. And the cost of that silence was written in the shallow breaths of the woman lying before him. The corridor outside the emergency bay was too bright, the kind of light that stripped faces pale and left no room for shadows. Mason sat rigid on a molded plastic chair. Ava perched beside him, her ribbon wound tight around her fingers as if it alone could anchor her to hope. The muffled rhythm of machines leaked through the curtain behind them, each alarm a reminder that time was not theirs to waste. Dr. Patel pushed the curtain aside and motioned toward a side conference room, a cramped space lined with medical charts and a flickering computer screen. We need to talk, he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. Mason followed, Ava refusing to let go of his sleeve. They settled around a narrow table littered with diagrams, echo printouts, and a half-empty cup of coffee gone cold. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy, as if even words here had to be sterilized. Dr. Patel tapped the echo image pinned to a light board. A ghostly heart flickered in grayscale, valves opening and shutting in jerky rhythm. He traced the distorted flow with a capped pen. This is Rachel's heart, he began. Specifically, her mitral valve. Mason leaned closer, though the shifting gray meant nothing to his untrained eyes. The doctor continued, his tone equal parts clinical and urgent. The mitral valve is supposed to act like a one-way door between the left atrium and the left ventricle. In Rachel's case, the door isn't closing. Blood is leaking backward with every beat. We call it severe mitral regurgitation. He circled a jet of color-coded turbulence on the Doppler scan. See this? That backward jet is why she's drowning in fluid. Her lungs are filling with blood that should be moving forward. Mason exhaled slowly, forcing himself to absorb each word. And the number you said earlier, ejection fraction? 30 to 35%, Patel confirmed. Normal is 60. It means her heart is pumping barely half of what it should. She's in NYHA Class 4 heart failure, the most advanced stage. Ava's small hand trembled against Mason's arm. Her eyes were red from crying, yet sharp with a child's intuition. She raised her hand as though in school. Her voice was no louder than a whisper. That's why she wakes up at night, right? Ava asked. Because she can't breathe when she lies down? The room froze for a moment. Even Patel paused, pen hovering above the paper. A child had pierced straight through medical jargon to the raw truth. Yes, he said softly. That's exactly why. Ava lowered her hand and clutched the notebook in her lap. Mason noticed for the first time the careful handwriting scrawled across its cover. Proof of the heart. He had no idea what it meant, but he saw how fiercely she guarded it, as if inside was something more precious than air. Patel resumed, his voice steadier. Without surgery to repair the valve, her heart will fail completely. Medication can only buy us hours, not days. She's already showing pulmonary edema, unstable arrhythmias, dangerously low oxygen levels. We're talking life or death. Tonight. Mason's throat tightened. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions under worse deadlines, but this was no contract. This was a countdown no spreadsheet could stop. How long does she have without surgery? He asked, each word heavy. Patel met his eyes, unflinching. Hours, not weeks. The phrase fell like a gavel. Hours, not weeks. Ava's breath hitched, and she pressed her face into Mason's coat sleeve. Patel pushed the consent form across the table again. We have an operating room available, a full surgical team on call, perfusion ready for bypass, but we need authorization. Without it, we can't legally proceed. Mason stared at the form. The black letters blurred. Consent for surgical intervention. Mitral valve repair. He wanted to seize the pen, to force the world to bend, but the law stood immovable. He was not kin. His signature was nothing more than ink. Ava's voice wavered. If you can fix her heart, why are we still sitting here? Why aren't you fixing it now? Patel's shoulders sagged. Doctors were trained to deliver hard truths, yet facing a child's plea was its own kind of cruelty. Because, sweetheart, he said gently, your mother is unconscious. She can't sign. And the state of New York requires a legal guardian to consent for surgery. But she doesn't have anyone, Ava whispered, the words barely escaping. It's just me. Mason placed a hand on her shoulder. He had built an empire on logic, but logic here was merciless. He looked back at Patel. There has to be a way. There is, the doctor replied. A temporary guardianship order. It can be filed through family court under Article 6. With that, you could consent. Mason's chest tightened. He knew enough law to understand what that meant. Petitions, judges, midnight hearings. The clock was bleeding away, each tick a risk to Rachel's faltering heart. And if we don't? Mason asked quietly. Patel's gaze was grave. Then the next time her heart slips into arrhythmia, we may not get it back. Silence swallowed the room. Ava's ribbon dangled limp, the blue threads tangled like veins on pale skin. Mason felt her lean into him, her tiny frame trembling. He looked again at the echo image, the grainy heart that refused to hold rhythm. A machine had captured her weakness, but the sight carved into him something deeper, the realization that behind every line and number was a life tethered by threads that could snap at any moment. Patel stood, gathering the papers. I'll give you a few minutes. He left them with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. Ava turned to Mason, eyes shining with both desperation and a stubborn faith only children could hold. You'll find a way, won't you? You always find a way. Mason swallowed hard. He was not her father, not her family, not even supposed to be here. Yet in her eyes, he had already become something he didn't recognize, a man she believed in. And belief, he realized, was the one currency stronger than law, stronger than fear. The night had grown heavier, as though even the air outside Mount Sinai carried the weight of a choice that could not be delayed. Inside the curtained bay, machines ticked and sighed around Rachel's fragile frame. Her chest rose shallowly beneath the BiPAP mask, each breath a fragile contract with life. Mason stood beside the bed, Ava's small hand still wrapped around his own. He had faced boardrooms lined with rivals who would sell his company's future for a whisper of profit. Yet never had he felt more cornered than in this narrow room with a clipboard lying on the tray table, waiting, accusing. A nurse entered quietly, her steps efficient but respectful, as though she carried both the burden of protocol and the knowledge of what was at stake. She laid the form down gently, smoothing its edges with fingers that had done this countless times. The paper gleamed under fluorescent light. "Surgical consent," she said softly. "If someone authorized can sign, we can move her to the OR immediately." Her gaze flicked to Mason. He wore power the way others wore coats, impeccable, tailored, commanding. But here, power meant nothing. Before he could answer, Ava climbed onto the chair beside her mother's bed. With hands trembling, she lifted the form. The paper looked oversized against her tiny frame, like a banner too heavy for a soldier too small. She turned toward Mason, eyes wet, voice trembling. "You have to sign, sir. You're the only one here." Her plea sliced through him more sharply than any hostile takeover or courtroom battle ever had. He reached out, steadying the paper before it slipped from her grip. The black text stared back at him. Mitral valve repair with annuloplasty ring and neocordy reconstruction. He knew contracts. He knew signatures could move millions, topple rivals, rescue empires. But this was no corporate paper. This was a lifeline. His throat tightened. "Ava, if I sign this, it doesn't count. I'm not her guardian. The hospital can't accept it." The girl's face crumpled. For the first time that night, Mason saw her strength falter. She pressed the form against his chest as if by holding it there, the ink might find its way through him. "But you're here," she whispered, broken but insistent. "Isn't that enough?" Mason closed his eyes. He wished it were. God, he wished it were. The curtain rattled open again, and Dr. Patel stepped inside, his expression tight from hours of balancing law with life. He glanced at the form clutched in Ava's hands, then met Mason's gaze. "She needs someone who can sign," the doctor said, voice clipped. "Without it, we can't wheel her into the OR. The ethics board won't allow it." Mason drew a slow breath. "And if we wait?" Patel didn't hesitate. "She may not make it to dawn." Ava's sob broke the sterile silence. She slammed the paper against the tray table, her notebook slipping from her lap and scattering across the floor. Loose pages fluttered, childlike sketches of hearts, diagrams copied from library books, notes scrawled in uneven handwriting. Mason bent down, picking up one page. It was a drawing of a heart with arrows showing blood flow colored in red and blue crayon. Across the bottom, in shaky block letters, Ava had written, "Fix it, so Mommy can breathe." The words blurred through the sting in his eyes. He pressed the page back into the notebook and closed it carefully, as if sealing something sacred. Patel cleared his throat. "There is a path. Family court. Article 6 guardianship petition. A temporary order could grant you authority." Mason glanced at his watch. Nearly midnight. The city above still roared with neon and traffic, but down here the world ticked by monitors and arrhythmias. How long would that take? "If you move fast, an emergency judge can hear the petition overnight," Patel replied. "But it will take someone willing to fight for it." Ava looked up at Mason. No words, Just those eyes, blue-gray like storm water, pleading with the quiet ferocity of someone who had already lost too much. Mason wanted to tell her no, to shield himself with the armor of reason. He was a businessman, not a savior. He had built an empire by keeping emotion out of signatures. But looking at her now, he realized signatures meant nothing without courage behind them. He reached for the form once more, holding it steady. "I can't sign this yet," he told her gently, "but I promise I will find a way to make it valid." Ava blinked, confused but clinging to hope. "How?" Mason bent to her level, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "By morning, I'll make sure I'm the one allowed to sign. I swear it." The nurse gathered the form again, reluctant but bound by protocol. "We'll keep prepping, but we need that order before we can proceed." As she left, Mason felt Ava's hand tighten around his. She clutched her ribbon with the other, pressing it to her lips like a prayer. "Don't let her go," she whispered. He looked down at Rachel, skin pale, body trembling beneath the mask, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't a stranger. Not anymore. The machines continued their urgent chorus. Beyond the curtained walls, the city never slept. But for Mason, time had narrowed to this: one child, one mother, one form unsigned. And the weight of finding a way before the night was gone. The hallway outside the ER was a cold tunnel of humming fluorescence and polished tile, as if designed to drain warmth from anyone who lingered too long. Mason strode down it with Ava at his side, her hand locked to his like a lifeline. Behind them, Rachel remained tethered to machines, her breaths pulled through plastic and prayer. Mason's phone vibrated in his palm as he pressed it to his ear, his voice sharp, urgent. "I need emergency legal counsel. Now!" On the other end, his longtime attorney, Harris Klein, was groggy, the gravel of sleep still in his throat. "Mason, it's midnight." "What? No time." Mason cut him off. "Mount Sinai. Patient in critical condition. Minor child, no guardian. They need consent for emergency surgery, and I'm the only one here." A pause, then Harris's voice sobered instantly. "You'll need Article 6 guardianship. Temporary order. Family court handles it." "How fast?" Mason demanded, pushing through the sliding doors into the frigid night air. Snow spit sideways under the neon glow of Amsterdam Avenue. Yellow cabs splashed through slush. The city's pulse never slowed, even when lives hung on the edge. "If you can file tonight, a judge can review. Manhattan Family Court has an emergency docket. You'll need to petition in person." Mason pulled open the back door of his black sedan. Ava climbed in wordlessly, clutching her blue ribbon as though it carried her mother's heartbeat. He slid behind the wheel, ignoring the driver's seat usually reserved for professionals. This night, there was no delegation. "Send me the petition form," Mason ordered. "I'll draft it on the way." Harris hesitated. "You realize this means stepping into guardianship, at least temporarily. You'll be legally responsible for the child." Mason's jaw clenched. He looked at Ava through the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide but dry now, as if tears had run out. "I already am," he said quietly, then hung up. The sedan roared down Amsterdam, tires hissing over wet asphalt. Red lights blurred into streaks as Mason weaved through the midnight traffic. Ava's voice rose timidly from the back seat. "Is Mom going to die?" Mason gripped the wheel tighter. "Not if we get this done in time." The GPS guided them toward Center Street, where the courthouse loomed like a stone sentinel against the night. Its steps were slick with snow, columns stark against the storm. The sedan skidded to a halt. Mason threw open the door, scooping Ava into his arms before her shoes touched the freezing slush. Inside, the building smelled of old paper and damp wool. A lone security guard blinked at them in surprise. Midnight was not an hour for visitors. Mason slammed his ID on the desk. Emergency petition, Article 6 guardianship, judge on call. The guard picked up a phone, muttering, "This better be good," and dialed. Moments later, a clerk appeared, hair pulled back, coat still over her shoulders, a thermos of coffee clutched in her hand. She squinted at Mason, then at Ava. "Follow me." They climbed marble steps that echoed underfoot, each step heavier than the last. The courtroom they entered was nearly empty, shadows pooling in the corners. At the front, a weary judge sat in his robe, spectacles low on his nose. His desk was piled with folders, the fluorescent lights above flickering like tired eyes. The clerk announced, "Emergency guardianship hearing, Your Honor. Petition filed verbally." The judge peered over his glasses at Mason. "State your name." "Mason Whitfield." "And your relation to the child?" Mason swallowed. "None. Not by blood. But I'm the only one here. Her mother is critical at Mount Sinai, hours from death without surgery." The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You expect me to grant guardianship to a stranger in the middle of the night?" Before Mason could speak, Ava stepped forward, her ribbon clutched to her chest. She looked impossibly small against the grandeur of the courtroom, her voice a trembling whisper. "He's not a stranger. He's the only one who stayed." Silence fell. The judge's pen froze mid-note. For a heartbeat, the room held only the sound of Ava's fragile words hanging like a plea carved into stone. Mason's chest ached, not from fear of denial, but from the truth in her voice. He had built his empire on never staying, always moving, always trading people for profits. Yet here, in the eyes of a child, his presence was the only currency that mattered. The judge cleared his throat, his expression softening beneath years of hardened routine. "Mr. Whitfield, do you understand the responsibility you're asking for? Temporary guardianship means medical, legal, and personal authority until the court reconsiders." "Yes," Mason said firmly. "I understand. And I accept." The judge scribbled his signature, the red stamp thudding onto the order like a heartbeat restarting. "Temporary guardianship granted." Mason exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He glanced at Ava, who pressed her ribbon to her lips and whispered, "Thank you." But the judge's words followed them like a shadow as they left. "Get back to that hospital. Time is not your ally tonight." Snow whipped harder outside as Mason carried Ava down the courthouse steps. The city lights blurred, but for the first time that night, a path was visible. A path signed not by ink, but by presence. And as he slid back behind the wheel, the guardianship order pressed against his chest, Mason knew. His signature would finally count. The clock inside Mount Sinai ticked louder than it had any right to. By the time Mason and Ava returned from family court, the eastern sky was paling with the faintest suggestion of dawn. But inside the hospital, time was measured not by sunrises, only by pulses and oxygen levels. Rachel was still in the ICU bay, her body locked in a restless struggle under the BiPAP mask. Nurses adjusted drips, adjusted monitors, their movements urgent but precise. Mason handed the clerk the stamped guardianship order, and she rushed to copy it into the patient's chart. Legally, he was now the one with authority. Yet the battle was not over. "Mr. Whitfield," said Dr. Patel, appearing with a group of residents trailing him like anxious shadows. "Before we wheel her to the OR, hospital policy requires the ethics board to approve surgery done under emergent guardianship. They'll meet in 5 minutes." Mason frowned. "We have the order. Isn't that enough?" Patel's jaw tightened. "In theory. But the OR slot is precious real estate. Tonight there's a transplant scheduled, another trauma case waiting. The board must decide whether to commit a midnight team to a surgery this high risk. Mason glanced at Ava, who stood hugging her notebook and ribbon. How many times would bureaucracy force this child to beg? They entered a conference room where the ethics board had already gathered. Around the table sat cardiologists, anesthesiologists, a nursing supervisor, a legal counsel for the hospital, and the board chair, Dr. Levine, a silver-haired man whose eyes carried both wisdom and weariness. On the screen at the end of the table, a digital clock glowed. 4:57 a.m. Patel presented quickly, his voice clipped with urgency. Rachel Hart, 42, admitted with decompensated heart failure, NYHA Class 4, severe mitral regurgitation, EF 30 to 35%, pulmonary edema on arrival, medical therapy failing, surgical repair is her only chance. One of the board members, a cautious anesthesiologist, folded his arms. Repair under these conditions carries high mortality. Without proper consent, it borders malpractice. Patel held up the stamped order Mason had secured. Temporary guardianship granted at family court. Mr. Whitfield is authorized. But another voice rose, this time from the legal counsel. Even with authority, we must weigh resource allocation, or time is finite. Surgeons are already scheduled. We cannot simply bump another case. Ava, who had been sitting silent in a chair too large for her, suddenly stood. Her notebook shook in her hands. She'll die while you argue. The words rang louder than any gavel. For a moment, even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to stop. The board members looked at the child, at her trembling ribbon, at the way her voice carried desperation no chart could quantify. Mason rose to his feet. You want to talk about allocation? Fine. Allocate to the living. Allocate to a mother whose daughter will not survive her loss. You speak of malpractice. What about the malpractice of hesitation? Dr. Levine steepled his fingers. His eyes flicked to Patel. What's the surgical plan? Annuloplasty ring with neocordae reconstruction, Patel said without hesitation. Repair over replacement to preserve ventricular function. Bypass expected, 6 hours or time, but achievable. Without it, she has maybe 3 more hours. The room shifted uneasily. The anesthesiologist muttered, high risk. Ava slammed her notebook shut and held it to her chest. Her cheeks were flushed with fury. But her eyes burned with something purer than anger. Faith. She's not numbers. She's my mom. If you wait, she won't even be numbers anymore. Mason placed a hand on Ava's shoulder. I'll assume liability, he said, voice hard. I'll indemnify the hospital. My company has resources. What I can't accept is a board that confuses caution with care. Dr. Levine tapped the table once, twice. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking clock. Then, finally, he nodded. The OR slot will be held until 6 a.m. If guardianship is valid, consent documented, and the team ready, the patient goes in. Patel exhaled. Mason squeezed Ava's hand. The girl's ribbon fluttered as though it, too, had found breath. As the board dispersed, Patel leaned close. You bought us 90 minutes. Use them well. Mason nodded. He looked down at Ava, who clutched the consent form in both hands now, its corners creased from her grip. We're not wasting a second, he told her. The dawn was coming. And so was the surgery. The hospital's corridors blurred into a maze of pale walls and humming vents, but Mason's mind was already split between 2 battlegrounds. One was measured in beats per minute, Rachel's fragile heart clinging to rhythm. The other was measured in stock price and shareholder confidence, the empire he had built and the board determined to protect it. As he stood in the waiting lounge, his phone buzzed insistently, the screen lighting up with the name of his CFO, Victor Hayes. Mason hesitated but answered. Mason! Victor's voice was brisk, unyielding. We need to talk. Now. I don't have time, Mason snapped, lowering his tone as Ava dozed beside him on a couch, her ribbon still coiled in her small fist. You'd better make time, Victor pressed. Word has already leaked. Investors are asking why the CEO of Whitfield Labs is throwing himself into the case of some stranger at Mount Sinai instead of focusing on tomorrow's merger vote. Mason pinched the bridge of his nose. She's not a stranger. Victor ignored him. Our biotech partners in Zurich are jittery. They've seen headlines about you filing emergency guardianship in family court. They think you're exposing the company to liability. If this patient dies under your watch, do you understand the narrative? CEO abuses power for personal crusade, risks millions in shareholder value. Mason's jaw tightened. I don't care about the narrative. I care about saving her life. There was a pause on the line, then Victor's tone hardened. With respect, you should care. If you lose this deal, Whitfield Labs' research pipeline collapses. We're not talking charity cases, Mason. We're talking therapies that could save thousands. You risk it all for one. Mason's voice dropped, icy. Therapies that cost thousands of families what they can't afford. You want numbers, Victor? Here's one. A 7-year-old girl begging me to sign a consent form because no one else would. That's what I'm risking for. Victor exhaled sharply. Walk away. Let the hospital handle it. Don't tether Whitfield Labs to this mess. Think like the man you built yourself to be. Mason glanced at Ava. Even in sleep, her brows furrowed as if nightmares chased her. He turned back to the phone. Maybe I don't want to be that man anymore. He ended the call without waiting for an answer. For the first time in years, silence after hanging up felt like freedom, not failure. Minutes later, his phone buzzed again. Not Victor this time, but a board member from Zurich, her accent clipped through the speaker. Mason, investors are concerned. If you insist on pushing this, you'll have to explain at the meeting why saving one patient outweighed the fiscal health of an entire corporation. Mason leaned against the window, the city below awash in sodium light and falling snow. He imagined the sterile conference rooms, the polished suits, the eyes of men and women who had never stepped foot in an ER. They wanted spreadsheets. He had seen tears. They wanted risk assessments. He had heard a child whisper, "Don't let her go." His reply was calm, steady, but unyielding. Tell them this. Whitfield Labs was founded on science that serves life, not numbers. If they can't stand by that, they don't belong at the table. He hung up again, pulse steady now. The war was no longer between profit and loss. It was between the man he had been, the strategist, the empire builder, and the man Ava already believed him to be. At 5:30 a.m., Dr. Patel reappeared, eyes lined with fatigue but burning with urgency. Ore is prepped. Anesthesiology on standby, perfusion ready. We roll in 30 minutes. Mason nodded, the guardianship order folded neatly in his breast pocket like a shield. Ava stirred awake, rubbing her eyes, and whispered, "Is it time?" "Yes," Mason said, crouching to her level. "It's time. They're going to help your mom." She clutched his sleeve. "You'll stay, right?" He held her gaze. "I'll stay, no matter what the shareholders say." As the surgical team wheeled Rachel past them toward the elevator, Mason felt his phone buzz one last time. He didn't look. He didn't need to. For once, the numbers could wait, because life would not. The family court chambers were never meant to feel holy, yet that morning they did. By the time Mason and Ava stepped inside, the pale gray light of dawn filtered through tall windows, throwing long shadows across the wooden benches. Snow still clung to their coats, melting into dark patches on the floor. The emergency petition had carried them here, but this was no mere formality. The hospital's legal counsel had insisted on a full review before surgery commenced, wary of liability. Thus, a hearing at dawn, with Rachel's life ticking away in the background. At the bench sat Judge Samuel Green, a man in his 70s with silver hair brushed neatly back. His robe was slightly rumpled, evidence that he'd been roused early. Yet his eyes were sharp, weighing each detail with the gravity of one who had sent children into foster care, signed restraining orders, and carved fate with a pen. Mason felt Ava's hand tighten in his as the clerk read out the case. Matter of temporary guardianship of minor Ava Hart, petition by Mason Whitfield. The courtroom was nearly empty save for the court reporter, the clerk, a hospital attorney, and one social worker pulled from her own sleep. But the emptiness made every sound echo. The shuffle of papers, the scratch of a pen, the nervous breath of a child. Judge Green peered over his glasses. Mr. Whitfield, why should this court grant you guardianship of this child and her mother's medical consent when you are neither kin nor long acquainted? Mason stood, shoulders squared, though his heart pounded harder than in any boardroom presentation. Because, Your Honor, I am the only one present. Her mother is unconscious, in critical condition. Without surgery, she will die within hours. The child has no father, no relatives at her side. If I don't assume responsibility, there is no one left. The judge studied him for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Ava. Child, do you know what this means? Granting this man guardianship gives him authority over decisions your mother would normally make. Ava's eyes glistened, but she nodded. Her ribbon dangled from her fist, damp with sweat. I know, she whispered. Do you trust him? The judge asked gently. A hush fell over the courtroom. Ava hesitated, then stepped forward, her notebook clutched to her chest. Her voice wavered but carried across the silence. Because he's the only one who stayed. Those words struck deeper than any legal precedent. Even the court reporter paused for half a second before resuming her typing. Mason felt them pierce through the armor he had built his entire adult life. To Ava, presence was proof enough. The hospital attorney cleared her throat, attempting to steady the balance. Your Honor, while the urgency is undeniable, we must caution against handing guardianship to a man with no legal ties. We recommend appointing the state as temporary custodian. Judge Green raised a brow. And how long would that take? At least 48 hours, sir. 48 hours, the judge repeated, his tone dry. Which, according to the cardiologist's report, is 45 more hours than the patient is expected to live. Silence. Even the hospital counsel folded her papers, conceding the truth. The judge leaned forward, his voice softened by the weight of decades on the bench. Mr. Whitfield, guardianship is more than signing forms. It is a pledge. Do you understand what it means to bind yourself to this child and her mother? Mason swallowed hard. Yes, Your Honor. I understand. And I accept. Green tapped his pen twice against the desk, then set it down. His eyes rested on Ava, who stood tall despite her trembling knees. Sometimes the law waits for family. Sometimes family is whoever refuses to walk away. He lifted the order, signed it with swift strokes, and pressed the red seal down with finality. Thud. The sound echoed like a verdict of hope. Temporary guardianship is hereby granted to Mr. Mason Whitfield, Judge Green declared. Ava let out a breath she had been holding for hours. She ran to Mason, wrapping her arms around him. For the first time that night, Mason allowed himself to kneel, holding her tightly, as though she were already his own. The judge's voice lingered like a benediction as they left. Go now. Save her. The court has done its part. The rest belongs to you. Outside, dawn spilled across the city. The courthouse steps were slick with snow, the skyline catching the first rays of light. For Ava, the world looked less like marble and stone, more like a chance. For Mason, the paper in his hand was heavier than any merger contract, any billion-dollar deal. It was the weight of guardianship, the weight of staying. The elevator doors opened with a sterile hiss, releasing Mason and Ava into the hushed corridor that led to the surgical wing. The air smelled faintly of iodine and cold steel. Rows of cabinets lined the walls, each labeled in precise block letters, while a large clock above the double doors ticked toward 6 a.m. Time was narrowing to a razor's edge. Dr. Patel was already scrubbed in, his eyes serious above the surgical mask that hung loosely around his neck. He gestured to Mason with a clipboard. "Consent is in the chart. Guardianship confirmed. We're ready." Mason nodded and squeezed Ava's hand. "This is it." The girl clutched her ribbon to her lips, whispering something only her heart could hear. She pressed her notebook into Mason's hands. "Keep this safe for me. It's proof." Proof of her heart. He tucked it into his coat, feeling its fragile weight like a covenant. Through the observation window, Mason saw the surgical team already in motion. Nurses checked trays of gleaming instruments, clamps and sutures arranged with mechanical precision. The perfusionist calibrated the heart-lung bypass machine, its tubes coiled like veins ready to take over the work of life. An anesthesiologist adjusted lines, whispering numbers to a nurse. Oxygen saturation, blood pressure, central venous access. Rachel lay on the table, her body draped in sterile sheets, her face pale under the halo of lights. Machines surrounded her like sentinels, each beep and hiss declaring both fragility and persistence. "Mr. Whitfield," Dr. Patel said quietly, "we're about to induce anesthesia and open her chest. You'll have to stay here." Mason swallowed hard. His instinct was to push past the line, to stand where the fight was. But rules were rules, and this battlefield belonged to them. He crouched beside Ava, brushing a strand of hair from her damp cheek. "She's in the best hands now." The girl's eyes were too old for 7. She nodded, though tears traced down her face. "Promise you won't leave?" "I promise," Mason whispered. The OR doors swung closed with a pneumatic sigh, sealing Rachel within. Mason and Ava were left in the observation room. A pane of glass, the only barrier between their helpless vigil and the battle for life. Inside, the anesthesiologist called out, "Induction starting." Rachel's body relaxed as medications coursed through her veins. The ventilator took over her breaths, steady, mechanical. "Prepare for sternotomy," Patel commanded. The scrub nurse placed a scalpel in his hand. The first incision traced down Rachel's chest, the red line stark against pale skin. Mason flinched despite himself, while Ava pressed her ribbon so tightly it left imprints on her palm. The team worked with the choreography of long experience. Sternum divided, retractors opened, the heart exposed beneath layers of tissue. The monitor sang a jagged rhythm, every beep amplified in Mason's ears. "Bypass ready," the perfusionist said. Tubes were connected, blood redirected. The heart-lung machine hummed to life, oxygenating, circulating, replacing. Rachel's heart was clamped, motionless, as if the world itself held its breath. "Annuloplasty ring," Patel ordered. A nurse passed the delicate device, gleaming silver. Patel's hands were steady, precise, as he sewed the ring into place along the weakened valve. Each stitch was a gamble, each knot a hope. "Neo corde," he said next. Fine sutures were guided into place, replacing torn tendinous cords with artificial ones strong enough to bear the load of life. Under the microscope, the work looked impossibly delicate, like threading hope through the thinnest of threads. Minutes bled into hours. Mason's eyes never left the surgical field, though he could barely understand what he saw. He measured progress not in instruments, but in the way Patel's shoulders squared, in the calm commands, in the absence of panic. Ava's small hand found his. She leaned against him, whispering as if in prayer. She'll make it. She has to. Finally, Patel spoke. Release the clamp. Let's see. The heart filled, pinked with blood, and then lub-dub. A single beat. Then another. The monitor spiked, rhythm returning. Stronger, steadier. Patel let out a breath that fogged his visor. Repair successful. Valve competent. EF should improve. The team erupted in quiet relief. The anesthesiologist announced stable vitals. Nurses exchanged glances of victory masked by fatigue. On the other side of the glass, Mason exhaled for the first time in hours. Ava gasped, pressing her ribbon against the glass as though trying to send it through. Her face broke into a trembling smile. Patel glanced up at the observation window. He raised his hand in a small nod toward Mason and Ava, a surgeon's benediction. The battle wasn't over. Rachel would need recovery, rehab, vigilance. But for now, her heart had been given back. Mason crouched beside Ava, voice low but steady. Hear that? That's your mom's heart beating again. Ava pressed her ear against his chest as though she could hear it through him. It's proof, she whispered. Proof of love. Mason tightened his arm around her, notebook still against his chest. For the first time, he believed it too. The ICU was never quiet, but after the operating room, its chaos felt softer, like the aftermath of a storm that had spared what it threatened to take. The monitors still beeped, the ventilators still sighed, and nurses still moved briskly between patients. Yet inside the bay where Rachel lay, the air carried something new. Survival. Mason sat in the recliner beside the bed, Ava curled on his lap. The girl clutched her ribbon as though it had carried them through the night. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she refused to close them. She kept staring at her mother's face, pale, yet alive, breathing with the help of a machine. Hours passed. The first rays of morning pushed against the blinds, filling the sterile room with muted gold. A nurse entered quietly, checked vitals, and turned to Mason. Her ejection fraction is up to 45%. Lungs are clear. She's stable. Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked down at Ava, who whispered softly, See? Proof. Later, as the sedation lifted, Rachel stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes trembling against her cheeks. Ava jumped to her feet, nearly tripping over the blanket. Mom? Mommy, can you hear me? Rachel's lips moved beneath the oxygen cannula. Her voice was faint, a whisper scraping its way back to life. Ava. The girl's small hands clutched her mother's fingers. You came back. I knew you would! Tears streamed down Mason's face before he could stop them. He turned away, embarrassed by the rawness, but Rachel's weak smile caught him. Her gaze shifted to him, questioning. He stayed, Ava said quickly, as if reading her mother's thoughts. All night. He made them fix your heart. Rachel's eyes glistened, and for a moment her lips curved, fragile but full of gratitude. Mason bowed his head, humbled. You did the fighting, he said softly. I just stayed. In the days that followed, recovery became a rhythm. Rachel was weaned from the ventilator, her breaths growing stronger each day. Physical therapists guided her through gentle exercises, coaxing her body back from the edge. Nurses adjusted medications, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, anticoagulants. each pill another stone laid into the foundation of healing. Ava never left her side. She read aloud from her notebook, the words shaky but determined. She showed Rachel the crayon diagrams of hearts, the pages where she had scribbled her observations. Shortness of breath at night, swelling ankles, fatigue. Her childish handwriting looked like prophecy now, proof that love had been watching, documenting, refusing to be ignored. One afternoon, while Rachel rested, Mason found himself alone with Ava in the hospital garden. Snow still dusted the shrubs, but patches of earth peeked through where the sun lingered. Ava skipped carefully along the path, notebook pressed to her chest. She stopped suddenly and turned to him. "Do you think she'll really be okay now?" Mason crouched down, meeting her eyes. "Her heart is stronger. She'll need medicine, therapy, and time. But yes, Ava, she'll be okay." The girl considered this, then opened her notebook to a fresh page. With her pencil, she wrote slowly, carefully, "Stay with love." She held it up for him to see. "That's what you said, right?" He nodded, throat thick. "That's exactly what I said." Rachel's rehab continued over the following weeks. She learned to walk again without gasping for air. She climbed stairs with a therapist at her side, each step a victory. Her smile returned, thin at first, then steady. During one session, Mason watched as Rachel managed 10 minutes on a treadmill at the lowest speed. Ava cheered from the corner, waving her ribbon like a flag. Rachel laughed, a sound Mason hadn't realized he'd been waiting to hear. It was fragile, yes, but it was also defiant. Afterward, Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, catching her breath. She reached for Mason's hand, her voice low but steady. "I don't know why you stayed, but thank you." Mason shook his head. "I didn't stay out of duty. I stayed because Ava looked at me as if I could, and I realized maybe I could." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then turned to watch her daughter skip down the hallway. "She's stronger than both of us," she murmured. Mason smiled faintly. "She's the reason both of us are still standing." On the last evening before Rachel's discharge, Ava climbed into her mother's hospital bed and pulled the blanket over both of them. She opened the notebook and read aloud one of her earliest entries. "Proof of the heart. Even when it breaks, it still wants to beat." Rachel kissed the top of her daughter's head. Mason, standing at the foot of the bed, felt something inside him settle, a sense that he had not only signed papers, but had been signed into a life he hadn't expected. That night, as the machines hummed softly and the city outside glittered with winter light, Mason whispered words he had never spoken in a boardroom, words that belonged only here, to these two fragile fighters. "We signed with courage. Now, we stay with love." The press room on Central Park West was modest by New York standards. No gilded chandeliers, no marble floors, just soft lights, rows of chairs, and a podium flanked by the seal of Whitfield Labs. Yet to Mason, it felt grander than any stage he had stood upon in his career. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm of cabs, snowmelt, and ambition. Inside, silence reigned as reporters shuffled their notepads, curious about the sudden press conference called by the man who had once been known as Wall Street's most calculating CEO. Mason stood at the podium, the guardianship order folded neatly in his breast pocket, though it was no longer needed. Rachel sat in the front row, her hair tucked gently behind her ears, her strength slowly returning. Beside her sat Ava, ribbon tied carefully around her wrist, notebook clutched to her chest like scripture. When the cameras clicked, Mason raised his head. He did not need to clear his throat. His voice came steady, born not of practice but of conviction. 2 weeks ago, I was handed a piece of paper in an emergency room at Mount Sinai, a consent form. A little girl lifted it to me with trembling hands and asked me to sign. I couldn't. Not legally. I wasn't family. But in that moment, I realized family is not always who shares your blood. Sometimes it is who refuses to walk away. The room hushed. Reporters lowered their pens, listening not as journalists, but as witnesses. He continued, his words slower now, deliberate. That night, a woman's life was saved because a child believed a stranger could stay, because the law allowed mercy to move faster than fear, because courage meant not waiting for someone else. Mason paused, letting the weight of silence rest before he delivered what mattered most. Today, I am announcing the creation of the Whitfield Labs Children's Heart Fund. This fund will provide full financial coverage for life-saving cardiac surgeries for children whose families cannot afford them. No child should wait for signatures while their heart fails. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half astonishment, half reverence. Mason pressed on. This is not charity, this is responsibility. Wealth without compassion is a hollow empire. I refuse to build hollow empires anymore. Rachel lowered her gaze, tears tracing silently down her cheeks. Ava clutched her ribbon tighter, her eyes wide with pride. From the back of the room, a reporter called out, "Mr. Whitfield, why now? Why this cause?" Mason looked down at Ava, then back to the room. Because once, a child placed her mother's life in my hands with nothing but faith. And because when you are given proof of the heart, you don't turn away. The conference ended not with applause, but with silence, the kind that follows something sacred. Later, back at the hospital garden where patches of snow still lingered, Mason walked with Ava and Rachel. The air smelled faintly of pine, winter loosening its grip. Rachel leaned on Mason's arm, her steps still cautious but growing stronger with each day. Ava skipped ahead, notebook open, pencil scratching furiously. She stopped, turned, and read aloud what she had written. Hearts can break, they can stop, but they can also be mended. By hands, by hope, by staying. Rachel smiled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Mason felt something settle deep in his chest, a rhythm stronger than any quarterly report, steadier than any stock price. As they reached the bench beneath the budding elm, Ava pulled the old consent form from her bag. Its edges were creased, corners bent, but it had been tied carefully with her blue ribbon. She held it out to Mason. "Keep it," she said simply. "It's proof of everything." Mason took it, his hands trembling more than they ever had signing billion-dollar contracts. He placed it carefully into his pocket, beside his heart. They sat together in the fading light. A man who had once lived for numbers, a woman who had fought back from the brink, and a child whose faith had reshaped them both. The world outside would always demand speed, profit, power. But here, on this bench, there was only presence. Mason looked at them and thought of the words that had carried them through courtrooms, operating rooms, and sleepless nights. Words that had transformed him more than any empire he had built. "Sign with courage," he whispered. "Stay with love." And for once, he knew he had. 10 years later, Central Park was filled with children's laughter. On a small stage, Mason stood beside Rachel and Ava, now a confident 17-year-old. A banner stretched above them. Whitfield Children's Heart Fund, 1,200 surgeries in 10 years. Mason spoke simply. "A decade ago, I thought I was signing a medical form. In truth, I was signing into a family, and into a promise to stay. Today, that promise has given life to thousands of children." Rachel smiled, her strength a quiet miracle. Ava raised her old blue ribbon, tied still around her wrist, and read from her notebook. No child should ever beg alone, because we will always stay. The crowd rose in applause. Mason held both of them close, whispering words that had carried them from one winter night to this legacy. Sign with courage. Stay with love. Thank you for staying with us until the very last heartbeat of this story. If tales of healing and second chances inspire you, please subscribe so you'll never miss the next journey of hope and love.